Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. This episode I'm going to continue taking a look at some of the 1897 mystery airship sightings that happened in North Texas. Last episode, I focused mainly on the UFO crash in Aurora, Texas in 1897, and this time I want to talk about just a general grab bag of different sightings in North Texas, because despite being from the area, I had no idea that it was kind of known for being a hotbed of this sort of activity. So, since doing the last episode, I started reading the book Operation Trojan Horse by John Keel. You probably know who John Keel is. If you're into paranormal stuff, he's the guy who wrote the Mothman Prophecies. That's what he's most famous for. But he wrote a bunch of other books as well. And I haven't finished Operation Trojan Horse yet, but I've been really enjoying it. I initially picked it up just to read through the chapter that was relevant to the mystery airships of 1897, but I'm now kind of just reading it for fun all the way through because it has a lot of interesting stuff in there. In particular, Keel calls out the high level of UFO activity in Texas, specifically in North Texas, multiple times in the book, which I was very excited to see. So in his analysis of the 1897 flap, Keel says that there are certain places or window areas that seem to have an unusual concentration of UFO sightings. I've talked about window areas before during my Fordham Hauntings series, but basically they're areas of heightened activity. Keel says that Texas is part of a large window area that's, quote, centered in the Gulf of Mexico and encompasses much of Mexico, Texas, and the Southwest. So, of course, the first thing that makes me think of is Roswell and that sort of thing. But it was interesting to me to see that Texas was included in that because I really do, in my head, I really think of like the Southwest as being the UFO area. And I don't really include Texas in that since Texas is just kind of its own thing. But John Keel specifically calls out, quote, the area around Dallas, Texas, which includes Denton, which I've talked about a lot on the podcast, and that's the county that I'm from. He specifically calls out that area as a UFO hotspot. He goes on to say, quote, Texas had more than 20% of all the sightings in 1897, and that state has had continuous sightings for the past 20 years. Operation Trojan Horse was published in 1970, if I recall correctly, so basically from the 50s to the late 60s, early 70s. And also, Keel claims that every UFO flap since 1964 began in the UFO hotspots that he identified. So, in addition to the Dallas area, that also includes parts of Michigan and Iowa. And I just thought that was really interesting because I had no idea. The hypothesis that the Dallas area is a UFO hotspot certainly seems accurate based on the events of spring 1897. Shockingly, between April 13th and April 17th, 1897, 23 Texas counties had a total of 38 separate reports of airship sightings, many of them in North Texas. Also, I literally just realized this while recording, but I am happy that this episode will be publishing during that window of April 13th to April 17th, of course, in 2023, so that's 126 years later. But I like that, this is unintentionally an anniversary sort of deep dive. So before I get into these Texas sightings, I wanted to elaborate on the 1897 airship sightings and touch on some details that I didn't include last time. So in the last episode, I was getting a ton of my background information on these sightings from the book Passport to Magonia by Jacques Vallée. And this time, like I said, I'm going to pull a lot of this from Operation Trojan Horse. So think of this as sort of a SparkNotes style recap of the relevant chapter of that, because it had some great info that differed from some of the stuff that I talked about last time. But to recap some of the stuff that I said last episode, people started seeing these mysterious airships in 1896. It began the week of Thanksgiving in California, and the mayors of Oakland and San Francisco both said that they saw these unidentified flying objects with their own eyes. In Sacramento, people claimed that they witnessed multicolored lights moving as if they were on yo-yo strings. In Oakland, people said that they saw an egg-shaped craft that was 150 feet long with 4 rotor-like arms. and a giant light that illuminated the ground beneath it. An electrician in San Jose said that one of the airship pilots asked him to help him out with some repairs, and he was brought to a field north of San Francisco to help out. And after that, the pilot was so grateful that he took the electrician to Hawaii. The electrician claimed that the trip took 24 hours. However, later on, his wife said that he had been home in bed on the night that he claimed to go on this trip. So, big grain of salt here. One man reported that an airship landed near his house and he spoke with the pilot. The human pilot had a beard and he said that the ship had come from the Montezuma Mountains. Sailors around the world said that they saw glowing spheres and saucer-shaped machines rising out of the water and flying away. Those were mostly seen on the coast of Japan and China, but some people saw them in Europe as well. Keel points out that that's really notable because at the time, news traveled slowly, so someone in China didn't necessarily know that people were seeing airships at the same time in California. Then in March and April 1897, the airship sightings started to spread outside of California. They were mostly seen in the Midwest, from Texas to Michigan. Keel writes that there are hundreds of reports that exist of these different sightings. However, no one actually sat down and collated them until Jacques Vallée and some other researchers did that work. At the time, reporters seemed to think that there was one airship that people were seeing all over, or at least some reporters did. But if you look at all of the reports together, it's clear that it couldn't have just been a single craft because it would have needed to be too many places at once. It sounds like the airship passengers were mostly believed to be human, regardless of whether the witnesses suspected that they had an extraterrestrial origin. A number of reports said that the crew of these crafts had beards, which I think was a really interesting detail. The Courier-Herald in Saginaw quoted someone who said that, quote, they had the longest whiskers they ever saw in their lives, which I found very funny as a statement about a potential alien. There's a great article from May 13th, 1897 from the Weekly World in Helena, Arkansas that makes it sound like the people inside these airships were definitely humans, or at least very human-like. In this story, a constable and a sheriff, who both signed affidavits asserting that their testimony was true, were on horseback at night and they noticed a light in the sky and they watched it descend. When they got closer, they saw two people with lights moving around the ship. And now I want to read a bit from the testimony. Just a quick note, I am kind of quoting from things a little bit more than I normally would because I realized as I was paraphrasing things, I was worried that I was kind of losing some of the meaning or slightly changing some of the meaning and rephrasing things. So if you're curious, that's why I'm reading a little bit more than I normally would. So anyway, the witness said, drawing our Winchesters, for we were now thoroughly aroused to the importance of the situation, we demanded, who is that and what are you doing? A man with a long dark beard came forth with a lantern in his hand and, on being informed who we were, proceeded to tell us that he and the others, a young man and a woman, were traveling through the country in an airship. We could plainly distinguish the outlines of the vessel, which was cigar-shaped and about 60 feet long, and looking just like the cuts that have appeared in the papers recently. So it was a dark, rainy night, and the woman who held an umbrella was standing sort of behind the men. The bearded man offered the witnesses a ride, and they said no thanks. They had a pretty mundane conversation. Witnesses asked questions about their lights, and they got some technical answers. Then they got to talking about what the airship travelers' plans were, and they said they wanted to go to hot springs for a few days and have some hot baths, but they didn't have enough time to do that. And they said that they were going to end up in Nashville after seeing the rest of the country. Then the witnesses left, and when they came back that way, the airship had departed. This is so funny to me because it really does just sound like normal small talk. It is remarkable in its unremarkableness. Another interesting detail was that some witnesses, including one in Michigan, heard voices coming out of these airships, almost as if there was a loudspeaker. I really liked this description that a witness gave. He said that the craft was about 800 feet long, big brute, row of Japanese lanterns all along top, large wide sail like a fan-tailed dove, dark bay in color, and I heard voices from above. So that's starting to sound sort of like a stereotypical UFO from the 20th century, at least, the idea of these Japanese lanterns around the top. That feels kind of like the porthole type lights you see in a lot of like UFO drawings and stuff from the 20th century. While it sounds like most of the interactions with these airships were positive, there was some more gruesome stuff that happened too. So one thing that really stuck with me is there was one story about a man named Alexander Hamilton who lived near Vernon, Kansas. A mysterious airship came to his farm and stole a cow. The inhabitants of the airship had put cable or wire around the cow, and as they were pulling it away, or pulling it up towards the craft, it got stuck in a fence. And Hamilton tried to free the cow, but he wasn't able to, so he had to let the airship get away with it. The ship lifted up the cow and carried it away. The next day, quote, "The branded hide, legs, and head of the animal were found on the property of Link Thomas, who lived about 4 miles away." So that feels like a precursor to so many of the livestock mutilation type stories that became so commonplace in later UFO lore. And it really stuck out to me among all these stories about sort of urbane exchanges, and conversations with the crew of these airships. It really feels like it took a turn with that story. All right, so that's kind of a general overview of some of the 1897 sightings throughout the country and to some extent throughout the world. Let's turn to Texas, but before we get to 1897, it's worth noting that there had been UFO sightings in North Texas prior to that. So in 1873 in Bonham, Texas, a group of workers in a cotton field witnessed, quote, "a great silvery serpent that dove down from the sky toward them. They ran away, and then the serpent tried to attack them again. Unfortunately, the chaos scared some horses that were pulling a wagon, and the driver fell and was killed by the wagon wheels." According to Operation Trojan Horse, on Thursday, January 24th, 1878, a man named John Martin saw, quote, "a large circular object pass overhead at high speed, which he described as about the size of a large saucer, evidently at great height," and that was near Denison, Texas. Martin may have been the first person to describe an unidentified object in the sky as a saucer, though it kind of sounds like that's debated because there's a more famous moment when someone described something as a saucer in 1947. I found a funny article in Texas Monthly. It's not supposed to be funny, I just found parts of it funny, that talks about this specifically. The author claims that Martin coined the term, saying, quote, "that honor rightly belongs to Texan John Martin, who had spotted one 69 years earlier." I just mentioned that because it makes me laugh. As someone who grew up in Texas, it feels really Texan to claim as many firsts as possible, no matter what the topic is. But the article really is interesting because it talks a lot about Texas's UFO connections that I just didn't know about. So to read a bit from the article, Texas can boast of having some of the most compelling evidence ever uncovered of alien visitors, such as Aurora's crash site, Lubbock's mysterious lights, or Dayton's close encounters. Texas has also bred its share of peculiar UFO devotees, such as Heaven's Gate leader Marshall Applewhite, who was born in Spur and had his first spiritual vision while walking along at Galveston Beach, as well as some members of the Republic of Texas who reportedly believe that the Marfa lights are proof of a subterranean energy grid that the Pentagon is trying to tap into with alien technology. MUFON, the world's largest UFO investigation organization, is based in Texas, as is NASA, which oversees an intergalactic radio signal monitoring program called SETI, or the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. So to me, it's a little bit funny to talk about Heaven's Gate, the founder being from Texas, in the same breath as kind of like some more positive maybe things about Texas UFO type connections, but, points for thoroughness, I guess. All right, so now let's look at some of these 1897 airship cases in Texas. I'll start with some sort of general sightings in various parts of the state, and then I'll go to sightings that are just in North Texas. The reason why I'm singling out North Texas, in addition to being from there and just having a particular interest in North Texas, is that I've talked about North Texas a lot on the podcast. I did a, I think, 9-part series on Goatman's Bridge in Denton County, Texas last year, about a year ago. And as John Keel pointed out, it is a interesting and active place, I guess. And like I mentioned last time, I found out about this whole UFO flap in the area because of my research into Denton County for my Goatman's Bridge series. All right, let's look at some of these 1897 airship cases in Texas. So in Rockland on Thursday, April 22nd, 1897, around 11 p.m., a man named John M. Barclay said that he saw, quote, an oblong machine with wings and brilliant lights. He was awoken by his dog barking. When he looked outside, he saw the ship, which landed in a pasture nearby. Barclay went out to see what was going on, and of course this is Texas, so he brought his rifle. He said that as he got near the ship, an ordinary mortal came out to talk to him and asked him to put down his gun. John Keel includes a sort of transcript of the whole encounter, which I will read. Who are you? Mr. Barclay asked. Never mind about my name. Call it Smith, the man replied. I want some lubricating oil and a couple of cold chisels if you can get them, and some bluestone. I suppose the sawmill hard by has the 2 former articles, and the telegraph operator has the bluestone. Here's a $10 bill. Take it and get those articles and keep the change for your trouble. Mr. Barclay reportedly asked him, What have you got down there? Let me go and see it. No, the man said quickly. We cannot permit you to approach any nearer, but do as we wish and your kindness will be appreciated, and we will call you on some future day and reciprocate your kindness by taking you on a trip. Barclay located some oil and the chisels, but he couldn't get the bluestone. He returned and tried to give the man back the $10 bill, but was refused. Smith shook hands with the Texan, thanked him, and asked him not to follow him to the object. Barclay asked him where he was from and where he was going. From anywhere, Smith answered, but we will be in Greece day after tomorrow. I really like that little turn of phrase, like, where are you from? I'm from anywhere. And, you know, there is this sense of anonymity, right? Where this guy's like, just call me Smith, a common name for this area, you know. It's some very cagey behavior from this dude. That same evening, about a half an hour later, another Texas man had a similar encounter. Here's the account from Passport to Magonia. Frank Nichols, who lived 3 kilometers east of Josserand and was one of its most respected citizens, was awakened by a machine noise. Looking outside, he saw a heavy lighted object land in his wheat field. He walked toward it, was stopped by 2 men who asked permission to draw water from his well. He then had a discussion with a half-dozen men, the crew of the strange machine. He was told how it worked, but could not follow the explanation. In Operation Trojan Horse, Keel says that the crew told Nichols that, quote, 5 of these ships were built in a small town in Iowa. Soon the invention will be given to the public. An immense stock company is now being formed, and within the next year the machines will be in general use. I'm not going to get into it here, but in Operation Trojan Horse, Keel does go into a whole sort of explanation or hypothesis about what this cover-up was about and why it was being manufactured. But yeah, it's just too much to get into here. Passport to Magonia also reports a case from Merkel, Texas that makes me think of the case I mentioned earlier where the man's cow was pulled up into the craft via a wire. So April 25th, 1897, in the evening, people returning from church observed a heavy object being dragged along the ground by a rope attached to a flying craft. The rope got caught in a railroad track. The craft was too high for its structure to be visible, but protrusions and a light could be distinguished. After about 10 minutes, a man came down along the rope, cut the end free, and went back aboard the craft, which flew away toward the northeast. The man was small and dressed in a light blue uniform. There's also a story in Passport to Magonia from Aquila Hillsborough. So this is April 26th, 1897, but it's an approximate date. A lawyer was surprised to see a lighted object fly over. His horse was scared and nearly toppled the carriage. When the main light was turned off, a number of smaller lights became visible on the underside of the dark object, which supported an elongated canopy. It went down toward a hill to the south, 5 kilometers from Aquila. When the witness was on his way back 1 hour later, he saw the object rising. It reached the altitude of the cloud ceiling and fell to the northeast at a fantastic speed with periodic flashes of light. All right, so let's look at some of these North Texas 1897 UFO sightings. So the whole reason why I know about this flap is because of the writing of Sean Treat, a former professor at the University of North Texas, who at least at one point ran a ghost tour company called Denton Haunts. I'm not sure if it's still active or not. It's a little hard to tell online. But the website for the company chronicles some of Denton's ghost stories and weirdness. And I stumbled across it, like I said, during my research for the Old Alton Bridge / Goatman's Bridge series. And a lot of the information that I found for this section of the episode is based on his research. So I just wanted to make sure to credit that right off the top. So the first Denton, Texas 1897 sighting was on April 13th, 1897, in rural Denton, a man saw a strange dark object move across the moon. According to Texas Escapes, quote, "A man stargazing with a pair of powerful field glasses spotted a dark object against the moon. At first he assumed it was a meteor that had not yet hit Earth's atmosphere, but then realized it was moving much too slowly. He described the object as being about 50 feet long, cigar-shaped with 2 large mugs sticking out from either side, a beak, like a ship's cutwater, at the front, and a large rudder or steering sail at the rear. Where the beak joined the main body of the object, there was a light that, quote, paled the moon in its brilliance. Along the body of the thing there were more lights, which he assumed meant windows. No smoke was visible from the object. It moved slowly in a southeasterly direction for about 20 minutes, then accelerated to terrific speed and vanished from sight." A woman in Denton said she saw a very similar thing, so there did seem to be more than one witness for this craft. The editor of the newspaper said that he knew both of them very well and found them credible, for whatever that's worth. Also, the Dallas Morning News published a drawing of what this airship looked like, which I have linked in the show notes, and it kind of resembled a giant flying fish, which I find delightful. The next day, there were more sightings in the area, so on April 14th, 1897, multiple people in Weatherford, Corsicana, and Cresson said that they saw a winged, cigar-shaped airship with a bright light beaming down from it. On April 16th and 17th, there were reports of airship sightings throughout the general area from people in Stephenville, Greenville, Granbury, Ladonia, Ennis, and Waxahachie. In the April 19th edition of the Dallas Morning News, all of the reports took up 4 full columns in the newspaper, and they were from 12 different towns in Texas and Oklahoma. Because remember, North Texas is near Oklahoma. According to Operation Trojan Horse, one of the April 19th stories said that when an airship flew over Farmersville, people could hear someone singing on the ship. One person claimed that the 3 people on the airship were singing "Nearer, My God, to Thee" and passing out temperance tracts. The Farmersville city marshal said that he was able to see inside the ship, and he saw, quote, "something resembling a large Newfoundland dog." He also claimed that he heard people in the airship speaking Spanish, but that could have just been because the Spanish-American War was kind of brewing at the time, so it's possible that anything kind of like foreign or scary might have been seen as Spanish. In Waxahachie, on April 17th, dozens of people saw an airship that they said was piloted by a young woman using something that looked like a sewing machine, which is a detail that I just love. In Stephenville, 25 people, including Sam Houston's nephew and the mayor, said that they actually met the people in the craft because they had to land to make repairs. I love the very steampunk descriptions of all of these airships. So, to read one description, describing a, quote, cigar-shaped body about 60 feet in length with immense arrow wings and upright rotors fore and aft like a metallic windmill, powered by storage batteries, the 2-man crew of Tillman and Dolbear revealed that they were, quote, making an experimental trip to comply with a contract with certain capitalists of New York. I think it's so funny how so many of these airship crew members have like very boring business explanations for why they're coming through the area and why they're kind of like flying around and going on this trip. Anyway, other people who saw these airships said that they met the inventor, whose name was Wilson, and who was naturally from Fort Worth. A telegraph line repairman said that he went on a tour of the airship and said that it was carrying US soldiers and dynamite on the way to Cuba to bomb the Spanish. Socialites in North Texas had lawn parties in the evening hoping to see these airships, and I just love the image of these fancy, southern Texas ladies all standing out in their gardens in the 19th century looking for UFOs. So the excitement and stories about the airships lasted until about May 1897, when they seemed to kind of peter out in the area. So before I close out this episode, I want to do a little bit of follow-up about the Aurora UFO crash case that I talked about last week, because as soon as I finished recording last time, like the next morning, I realized that I had completely forgotten to include the information from the MUFON report about the crash, even though it was still up in a tab on my browser and I had meant to add that stuff to the episode. I just forgot. So I want to read a bit from the report because it gives some additional information that I didn't mention last time. Reportedly, record from the crash site was dumped into a nearby well located under the damaged windmill, while some ended up with the alien in the grave. So last time I talked a little bit about how it didn't really make sense that there were only a few pieces of metal in the grave with the alien, and I had totally forgotten about this well thing. I mean, it's still, some of my thoughts still stand, but I did think it was valuable to mention that it seems like the pieces were split into two different underground spots, the well and the grave. So to keep reading, adding to the mystery was the story of Mr. Brawley Oates, who purchased Judge Proctor's property around 1945. Oates cleaned out the debris from the well in order to use it as a water source, but later developed an extremely severe case of arthritis, which he claimed to be the result of contaminated water from the wreckage dumped into the well. As a result, Oates sealed up the well with a concrete slab and placed an outbuilding atop the slab. According to writing on the slab, this was done in 1957. MUFON also pointed out that it was strange that there was never any sort of follow-up news report to the original article that was published in the newspaper about this crash. So some people claim that that is evidence that it was a hoax. I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. During an episode of UFO Files that aired on December 2nd, 2005, MUFON found some people who had witnessed the crash. So to read from that, Mary Evans, who was 15 at the time, told of how her parents went to the crash site. They forbade her from going, and the discovery of the alien body. Charlie Stevens, who was age 10, told how he saw the airship trailing smoke as it headed north toward Aurora. He wanted to see what had happened, but his father made him finish his chores. Later, he told how his father went to town the next day and saw wreckage from the crash. I also found a somewhat unique description of the pilot's headstone. So I believe last time I talked about how some reports said that the headstone seemed to have like a sort of traditional or like archetypal image of a UFO, like kind of that flying saucer image. But to read from a Texas Monthly article, according to local legend, the grave was marked only by a headstone bearing a cryptic insignia. Several small circles drawn inside the Greek letter delta. The stone has since disappeared. So I don't know what the Greek letter delta means in that context, but it's interesting and mysterious and I like it. It's a nice little detail. All right, so that's what I've got for this time. I haven't quite decided what I'm going to do the next episode about, but I'm probably going to talk about paranormal investigation, technology, and nostalgia, because that's something that I have been writing about a lot on my blog/newsletter, which you can read at buriedsecretspodcast.com or on my Medium account or on my Substack, which are all linked from my website, buriedsecretspodcast.com. So I've been doing these daily blog posts or, week daily blog posts. And kind of my goal with that is to help me refine some of my thinking, like flesh out ideas, get stuff down on paper, that sort of thing. And the really handy thing about it, and the thing that I hope is going to be the case, is that by writing these blog posts, I'm sort of pre-writing and working out ideas for podcast episodes. So if you read my newsletter/blog, you'll probably get a little hint at some of the stuff that I'll be talking about in future podcast episodes, though, I might be kind of approaching it from different angles or different levels of detail. But yeah, it's probably going to be about nostalgia and paranormal investigation tech, since that's really on my mind right now. So if you want to hear from me between now and the next episode, you can check out my blog/newsletter to get a regular, week daily update about miscellaneous things that I'm thinking about, mostly related to the paranormal or research things or creativity, kind of stuff in that zone. I go kind of like a little bit further afield than I do with these episodes, which are a little bit more focused on paranormal, occult, and weird and forgotten history stuff. So if you want some of my weirder ideas, that's where to go for that. Other than that, you can follow me on Mastodon at Buried Secrets Podcast at weirdo.network. That is the place where I am currently kind of most active, so follow me on Mastodon. I'm still on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcast. You can email me at buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com. And if you liked this episode, please rate and review it on whatever podcast you're listening to it on. Please tell your friends about it. That really helps get the word out about the podcast. And thanks so much for listening.